Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and rattle on about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we have reached the shores of the New World, folks. That's right, we're covering the Merfolk legends and myths of the Americas. Now, I'll be focusing on the stories of the native peoples of the Americas, as most of the stories of the various settlers and colonists feel like an outgrowth of European traditions to me. That said, we are covering a lot of territory today, so if I missed a legend or myth you know of, please share it in the comments below, especially if you can point me to a source I missed. Thank you in advance. Also, I am just going to mention one more time that this topic was chosen by my ever-wise patrons, whose ranks you can join for as little as $1 a month by clicking on the link below. Now, let us turn to the stories of Merfolk in the Americas. A good number of these stories are going to come to us from the Passamaquoddy tribe, whose traditional territory is in modern Maine in the United States and New Brunswick in Canada. The tribe still lives there, and they are a federally recognized tribe in the United States, but they were forced off their ancestral land into a set of small scattered reservations, and today there are less than 5,000 registered tribal members, I'm sad to say. Before being conquered and forced off their lands, they lived in a seasonal pattern, moving inland for hunting and shelter during the winter, but spending much of the year alongside the coast and riverside, harvesting all manner of seafood, which might explain why they have so much aquatic lore, I think. The Passamaquoddy tell us of the Abu Damkin, an evil fairy-like creature that would wait for adults to wander off alone to cast evil spells on them, and they would also abduct and eat any children they found unguarded, and just generally be unpleasant to humans. They were described as having the upper body of a human and the lower body of a fish. There was also a more benign version, called the Lampaguin, that was a group of shapeshifters that could assume human form, although they were often described as having a fish tail. Now, the main story I found about the Lampaguin was that they liked to go swimming and they would often leave their clothes in a heap on the riverside. And if you came upon those clothes and grabbed them and took off running, they would of course chase you, as most people do when you steal stuff from them. At that point, if you could bop one on the head with a stick and then drop the clothes, not only would they leave you alone, but the one you bopped on the head would agree to marry you, which I guess isn't the weirdest courtship ritual I've run into, but it's gonna be in the conversation. And while we're talking about this, there's an awful lot of kidnapping in mermaid mythology, isn't there? I mean, it goes both ways. We've seen plenty of mermaids willing to kidnap humans, as well as humans kidnapping mermaids, and perhaps I should have expected it, all things considered, but honestly, this has caught me off guard. What do you guys think? Is it weird that there's so much kidnapping going on in mermaid mythology, or am I just, making a big deal out of nothing? You tell me. That said, the main stories I found were about people transforming from humans into part human, part snake people who had to live in the water. Now, I know some of my viewers in past videos have insisted that snakes are not aquatic, and I just have to say, the 200 species of semi-aquatic and fully aquatic snakes, including 69 species of sea snakes who live in the ocean, some of whom can't even move on the land, want to know why you're denying their existence. Are they a joke to you, bro? Anyways, I found two stories that came up in every source I looked at, so I'm going to talk about both of them here. Our first story is about a pair of young ladies who ignore their chores, disobey their parents, and constantly skip out on community events to go frolicking in the water, and are generally considered irresponsible and perhaps a little antisocial. Well, through unknown but possibly foul means, they figure out how to stretch their body into snake forms, or snake-like forms, I should say, as the myth describes them as becoming slimy below the waist, and as far as I know, most snakes are not slimy. They keep doing this until they reach the form of snakes with a human head. Now, this isn't a problem for them because they can change back and forth as long as no other human sees them in their snake form. And as you can guess, one day a young hunter is out and about and he, well, sees them. And, as seems to be the thing in these myths, steals their clothes and goes running back to the village to tell everyone. The village, perhaps wanting him to be wrong, rushes out with him being held by a number of strong lads, in case he was fibbing to cover up some sort of dark act of his own, but it turns out he was telling the truth, and the ladies, hiding behind a bush, poking out only their heads, declare to their former friends and families, in song no less, that they're leaving forever to go party in the ocean and with all the other water snake people. I kind of imagine them almost doing this sort of screw you land-loving losers, I'm heading to the ocean where people know how to party thing before they, swoosh off forever. In the other version of the story, we still have a pair of sisters who are generally considered good girls in this one, but maybe they love swimming a little too much. And despite the warning of their parents, one day they sneak off to the river after finishing their chores and don't leave the water in time. They call out to their parents, who come rushing to the river to find that their girls are now snake from the waist down and human from the waist up, and their parents immediately start despairing. The girls, however, comfort their parents, saying, hey, this isn't your fault, Mom and Dad. This is all on us, but we don't want you to fret. We can still help out. We can now carry your canoe everywhere you need to go, and they do that for as long as their parents live. So at this point, Mom and Dad have the fastest canoe in the waters, which is nice, and it's good that the girls are helping their family out, but I'm willing to bet Mom and Dad would rather have their girls at home with legs and feet rather than out in the rivers as snake people. But I guess you just have to make do sometimes, right? Nearby, in the Atlantic provinces of Canada, we have the Micmac people, who still live in those provinces, numbering about 70,000 strong, and they tell stories of the Sabawanilnu, or the halfway people, or sometimes even just called the water people. Now, they are described as not just being smaller than humans, but also having the lower bodies of fish. Despite their small size, they weren't powerless. They had the ability to summon and control storms, and they were willing to use those storms if they felt disrespected. If they were treated well, however, they were fairly benevolent and known to protect travelers and fishermen. You could even learn to predict the weather by listening to their songs. Honestly, they sound like useful neighbors to have if you can mind your manners. We move inland, and our next story comes to us from the Lakota people, who are one of the major subgroups of the Sioux tribe of the Great Plains in North America. Honestly, I'm kind of surprised they have mermaid stories, but it turns out they got at least one. In this story, a young lady marries a young man with a terrible temper, and while he never hits her, he is constantly berating and scolding her and telling her she can't do anything right, until she just can't take it anymore. So she takes her baby to her brother, telling him to bring the kid over whenever he's hungry, and flees into a nearby stream and turns into a mermaid. Somehow, the versions of the story I found never explained this. And the brother would bring the kid by whenever he was hungry, and she would feed him. And this continued for a while, but eventually, I suppose, the brother got tired of raising his sister's kid, and he ran off and tattled to her husband, who ambushed her, dragged her home, and cut off the fish parts, which leads to her bleeding to death to everyone's regret. So this is one of the darker stories in this video. I probably shouldn't have to say this, but just in case, 1, be kind to your spouse. 2, don't cut bits off your spouse. What is wrong with you? This has been a public service announcement. Thank you very much. We continue heading west to the Yosemite Valley, once the territory of the Ahwahneechee tribe, which today is still fighting for federal recognition from the United States government, and was driven out of the valley in the late 1800s by the armed forces of the United States. They tell stories of predatory mermaids who used their singing to try and lure hunters and warriors to them so they could drown them and eat them. There's an awful lot of drowning and eating people in mermaid mythology, but I kind of expected that, so I'm not as surprised as I am by the kidnapping. However, the Anwanichi people were wise to this, and were generally able to avoid falling for the somewhat obvious lures and traps that the mermaids usually used. There is a story of a young man who was not quite as fortunate, however. See, one day, two brave, strapping young men went fishing in mermaid-haunted waters, and those sneaky mermaids were able to snag their net and tie it to the bottom of the river. One of these young men, perhaps being braver than wise, jumped into the water to unsnag it, and the mermaids quickly grabbed the net, tied it to his toes, and used that to hold him under the water until he drowned, with his friends standing there on the shore, unable to do anything. Once that man had drowned, the mermaids kind of just carried his body off for dinner. So, I guess the moral of the story is always go swimming with a buddy. Now let's turn south and east to the Caribbean. Now I did talk about Caribbean mermaids in my Divine Merfolk videos, and I mentioned how African beliefs and stories had a heavy influence on those mermaids through cultural diffusion. In this case, by boatloads of kidnapped Africans who were enslaved, bringing their beliefs and stories to the Caribbean. So, if you'd like to know more about that, I'll ask you to head back to those videos and give it a listen if you haven't seen those videos already. I would also suggest looking at the African Merfolk videos as well. Now, for those of you coming back or sticking around, let me introduce you to MacLeod, who likely got her start as a version of Mammy Wada, but I think she's translated to her own distinct tradition at this point. MacLeod is part woman, part anaconda, sometimes having the upper body of a woman, or just being a woman's head on a complete snake body. She's known to torment people, especially men, who she feels have committed crimes against the natural world, or just been disrespectful louts in general. If you run into her in the wilderness and you want to avoid trouble, your best bet is to take off your left shoe, turn it upside down, hold it in your hands, and walk backwards all the way home. In all fairness, I don't think I would want to turn my back on something that powerful and dangerous either, so not turning your back does sound like sound advice. It wasn't just men who had to fear her, as a young lady known as T. Jean found out to her misfortune. T. Jean was a washerwoman known widely for her beauty and her singing ability. One day, as she was washing clothes and singing to herself, MacLeod came upon her and accused her of vanity. T. Jean, in response, bravely stood her ground and demanded to know who was casting aspirations on her while hiding themselves. This irked MacLeod, who revealed herself and, in retaliation, turned T. Jean into a mermaid and basically press-ganged her into service as an assistant and an entertainer to, basically sing for MacLeod's amusement. Now, at the end of the story, it's said that T. Jean managed to escape, find, and marry a human husband, but I can't find the story of those events anywhere. So, if you know that story and you can point me to a source, please share in the comments, and I would be happy to know about it. Thank you very much in advance. Okay, so let's head to South America and start down there with the Warao of Guyana, who told stories of the Ahuba, a pair of divine fish with human heads who rule over all the fish in the world and live in an underground spring that was the source of all waters in the world. So once again, we're running into the belief of underground tunnels linking every body of water. I just want to make a note of that. The Ahuba were believed to feed on the drowned victims of shipwrecks, so not particularly nice divine fish people. Continuing that theme of not particularly nice, if I could put it mildly, in Brazil we had the Oiaru, who were part human, part dolphin. Now, in the original stories, these creatures were mostly male, although a lot of my sources note that upon exposure to European stories, the natives kind of shifted that over to stories of these being mostly female. One big thing to note is that in the original myths, they were shapeshifters who really loved getting what I'm going to call romantic in deference to our dread Lord Algorithm, terror be on his name, with human women, and often didn't really care what human women thought about that. So they were very dolphinish, I guess I could say there. Either way, not good neighbors to have, right? Over in Peru, there's a mermaid story that centers on a young shaman named Gregorio, who was poor but honest, and worked to provide for his wife and children by fishing. He struck up a friendship with a mermaid who lived in a nearby waterfall, and one day she offered him a favor, and he asked for a good catch of fish to feed his family. Now, she asked, "Are you sure that's what you want?" But perhaps wisely, he stuck to his modest request. So she gave him a good catch of fish, and he brought it home. His wife emptied the basket that night and found a little plain gold ring at the bottom of the basket. Now, she was a little concerned, but she told herself it didn't mean anything. After all, fishermen find things in the river sometimes. That's what happens. So she just hid the ring, and she would worry about it later, she told herself. Well, a couple days later, the mermaid offered Gregorio another favor, and he wisely stuck to just asking for fish to feed his family. And once again she said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, absolutely. Just the fish, ma'am." So that night, his wife found not a little gold ring, but a big, heavy gold bracelet, much nicer and more ornate than that ring from the last time, and that made her grow worried. After all, they were very poor, and what if, out of desperation, Gregorio had turned to theft to try and provide for the family? This could be a disaster for all of them, and if he wasn't stealing, why would he keep this a secret from even her? So she decided to confront her husband. That morning, when he got up and went fishing, she followed him to his fishing grounds to confront him, and it's there she saw the mermaid, whose human half was gold in color and her fish half gleaming silver. The mermaid turned and made eye contact with the wife, as she sat there gasping in shock. And without so much as a blink, the mermaid just reached out, grabbed Gregorio, and pulled him into her waterfall, where he remains to this day. There's also a very brief story in Chile about women who are swept out to sea being doomed to turn into mermaids and never being allowed to return to land. So I feel both these stories are pretty dark here. Not as dark as the Lakota story, but still pretty dark. As I mentioned before, I really hate to end on a down or dark note, so let me tell you a somewhat happier story. Let's talk about the Ayara of Brazil, who is described as having green hair, copper-colored skin, and the tail of a river dolphin. More evidence for the insistence of one of my ever-wise patrons that mermaids would in fact be sea mammals, not fish, I suppose. Ayara is said to greatly enjoy human male company, and likes to use her enchanted singing to lure men to her, whereas upon seeing her, men become obsessed until they allow her to take them away to her enchanted underwater kingdom. Forever. Well, it just so happens that there's this rough but good-hearted and honest country boy named Alonzo knocking about. One day, after coming home from a long day of work, he saw a beautiful woman being attacked by a wild dog, and she's just barely fending it off with her fan. Alonso rushes over and with a single barehanded punch kills the dog and saves the lady, whose name was Julia. Julia brought him home to her parents in gratitude, and over some months they became somewhat interested in each other, and that led to them becoming engaged. Now, Alonso was saving up his money so that he could afford to buy property and land and be able to provide a good life for his lady love, Julia. In the meantime, he lived in a simple hut by the forest he had built by himself, and often coming home hot and sweaty from laboring outside all day, he would go into the forest to bathe in a clear, dark pool he had found. Well, one day, as he was bathing, he heard the song. Alonso was unaware of what this song meant, but it troubled his sleep, and being an honest man, he confided in Julia, who was very aware of this song and what it meant, and weepingly made him promise not to go back to the forest for anything. He managed to stay by that promise for weeks, until one very hot and sultry night, being unable to sleep, he went back to his pool just to cool down, and that's when he heard the song. And not being a foolish man, he ran for his life. He was also an honest man, as I said, so the next day he went straight to Julia and confessed everything. Julia realized at this point that Alonso was not going to be able to resist this song on his own, and she gave him an enchanted seashell that she had put a song of her own into. Now, it doesn't say this in the story, but this leads me to believe that Julia had some magical knowledge of her own. Again, I'm just making inferences here. So, Alonso cooked this seashell and he kept it with him. For 3 nights, Ayara would sing from the forest, not letting poor Alonso get any rest, until finally he snapped. He had had enough. Alonso cooked a pistol that I imagine he inherited from his father, although the story doesn't say. This is a detail I'm putting in here. And he resolved to put an end to this matter one way or another. And he marched to that pool full of grim purpose and fire, and called out to Ayara to show herself, and, laughingly, she did. His heart stopped, but he was still determined to do the right thing, so he raised the pistol and fired, only for it to have no effect. Ayara started singing, and Alonso found that, against his will, his feet were taking him into the depths of the pool. Frantically, he shot again, but Ayara was not going to be stopped by any craft of mortal men. The shot, however, made him stumble, losing his balance, and his free hand fell on the seashell that he had kept with him. And remembering the tearful entreaties of his lady love, Alonso put the seashell to his ear and found Julia's singing voice dispelled the enchantment, forcing the mermaid to flee howling in disappointment. Alonso then returned home and married Julia, and they lived happily ever after. So on that happy note, let me say thank you for listening. I hope you found this video informative, or at least entertaining. If you did, please leave a like, comment, or even subscribe. All of these help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord Algorithm. Dare be on his name. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest Patreon supporter. I could not pull this off without his support. I'd also like to thank all of my otherwise patrons as well. So, just so you guys know, there's going to be a bit of a skip here. For the last 10 weeks, I've been able to release a video every Friday, but in all honesty, there is simply too much written European lore and mermaid mythology for me to be able to meet that deadline and give you a video that I'm comfortable releasing quality-wise. So I'm aiming for a release date of the 21st of June, and I'm going to just let you guys know up front, Europe might be as many as 3 or more videos. I hope you'll join me for those videos, but until then, let me just say, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.